Coloured stones have been at the heart of Western art and architecture for over 2 millennia. Already used by the Egyptians and in the palaces of Hellenistic rulers, it was only with the expansion of the Roman Empire, beginning in the late Republic, that their use spread throughout the Mediterranean basin. The historian Suetonius tells us that the Emperor Augustus boasted he had found a Rome built in brick, but left his citizens a city made of marble. Indeed, it was because the Romans imported coloured marbles from every quarter of the Mediterranean that their capital, Rome, which had previously been built from only brick or local rock, transformed into a monumental metropolis clad in exotic stones, which materialized the territorial expanse of their empire, its universal character and power. Over 500 years, reaching a peak under the Emperor Trajan in the 2nd century AD, Rome nourished an artificial geology. Coloured marbles covered the floors and walls of temples, baths, the forums, palaces and private homes, much of it in the technique called opus sectile, whereby thin slabs were cut to make intricate inlays, both geometrical and figurative. Coloured marbles also became 3D in the forests of columns that subsequently populated the churches and monuments of Rome. And the huge basins from the ancient baths that we still see today, repurposed as fountains in the city's many piazzas. Coloured marbles were also used for statues, where they sometimes imitated animal hides, or embodied the theme of the subject represented. For example, wine-coloured rosso antico for a tipsy faun, or violet pavonazzetto for the flayed flesh of the tortured Marsyas. A complex system of quarries, delivery roads, cargo ships, ports and warehouses were all necessary to ensure this constant flow and tonnage of coloured marbles arriving from the various provinces of the empire. Green serpentine, for example, was extracted in Greece, while violet-streaked pavonazzetto came from quarries in Turkey. The deep-hued stone known as porphyry, as well as many of Roman alabasters and granites, came from Egypt. The so-called granito del foro was extracted at Mons Claudianus in the eastern desert of Egypt, where one can still admire huge column shafts discarded 2,000 years ago when they were barely roughed out. From nearby quarries in the same eastern desert also came porphyry, the luxury stone par excellence, because it recalled the saturated purple of royal robes. Statues of emperors were therefore often made from porphyry, and in late antiquity these same emperors had their mortal remains and those of their relatives buried in porphyry sarcophagi. One of the very few Roman buildings in which one can still admire the rich marble palette of Roman imperial architecture is the Pantheon, which the Emperor Hadrian inaugurated about 126 AD. This building's immense monolithic columns, almost 12 meters high, each weigh about 60 tons. These columns reached Rome from Mons Claudianus and Aswan only after a long journey across the desert, along the Nile, over the Mediterranean Sea and up the river Tiber. To this day, the floor, walls and columns of the Pantheon display marbles that originally came from the four corners of the empire. In late antiquity, and above all after the fall of the Western Empire and the progressive closure of her quarries, Imperial Rome became an open quarry herself. Throughout the Middle Ages, marbles maintained their symbolic power. Pagan temples, public buildings, and private homes were all systematically stripped of their marbles to build and embellish the new Christian churches. The marvellous polychrome floors that cover the naves of many churches in Rome and central Italy are called cosmati work, taking their name from the family of stonemasons, the Cosmati, most active in medieval Rome. It was the Cosmati who sawed Roman columns into slices, like a salami, to create the large discs of porphyry and serpentine that punctuate these pavements. When Renaissance and Baroque artists recovered the principles of classical art and architecture, they also attempted to resurrect ancient forms of decoration, recycling ancient marbles, especially to adorn the chapels of the nobility in Roman churches. So it is that ancient Rome was resurrected materially, not just in spirit, to renew the city as the capital of the Counter-Reformation Church. But artists also procured ancient marbles privately to create vases, busts, reliefs, and tables, as, for example, the famous Farnese table that the architect Vignola designed in imitation of ancient opus sectilae. From the late 17th century, private collectors began to seek out samples of coloured marbles with a passion that straddled aesthetics and the newborn science of geology. A splendid example is the album commissioned by Leone Strozzi, in which thin slices of marble and semi-precious stones were framed by and set between leaves of parchment. A more typical example of this passion for marble specimens is the Marble Library of Cardinal Riminaldi, which is perhaps the most sumptuous of the many lithotheks created in the era of the Grand Tour. Collectors across Europe were particularly keen to acquire the varied grids of square or rectangular marble samples that were produced in Rome from the late 18th to the early 19th centuries and then disseminated throughout Europe. Today these collections are mainly preserved in museums of natural science, and they are chiefly appreciated for their geological importance, while their intimacy with the visual arts and architecture has slowly faded. The Santarelli collection exhibited here at the Capitoline Museums is therefore an invitation to reconsider the fundamental role that the coloured marbles of ancient Rome played in Western taste and culture for over 2,000 years.